Hello and welcome to another InfoReady webinar. Over the next hour, we'll hear from Dr. Stephen Beck from Louisiana State University and from Dr. Stuart Borrett from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Together, we'll learn how a research office can recover from overwhelming natural events. LSU is a survivor of Hurricane Katrina, and UNCW has faced two major hurricanes in the last 2 years. Their lessons have valuable insights, tactics for being resilient in the face of COVID-19 today. So let's join them now as our webinar is about to begin.
Welcome everyone. My name is Carlos Moncada, Director of Client Services at InfoReady. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for the Peer Spotlight webinar. The Peer Spotlight webinar today is titled Research Planning and Resiliency of the Research Enterprise. And we have two guest panelists today, Dr. Stephen David Beck from Louisiana State University. He's Associate Vice President in the Office of Research and Economic Development. We have Dr. Stuart Borrett from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He's the Associate Vice Provost for Research and Innovation. Sorry, Associate Provost, my apologies, Stuart. Some of the topics we're discussing today include how the research enterprises responded to impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, strategies for restarting the research enterprise, and how InfoReady Review was used for some of these processes. We're going to go into a lot more, but they have a few slides that will cover that. The bulk of our time today is going to be focused on Q&A. I know that's where people get the most value from attending these. And I think you have two great guest panelists that have quite a bit of experience with being able to adapt to sudden change. So before we turn it over to the panelists, I would like to go over some of the logistics. The presentations will be about 20 minutes total, give or take. And then the bulk of the remaining time will be Q&A with the panelists. Dr. Beck will go first, and he's going to focus on the initial response LSU had to COVID-19, among other things. And then afterwards, Dr. Borrett will follow with a focus on strategies for restarting the research enterprise. But it's not strictly focused on that. They'll talk about other topics, of course. And with that, Dr. Stephen David Beck. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. Excuse me. If we could go to the next slide. First, just a couple of words about LSU. We're in addition to being the national champion in football, we are also an R1 research university, flagship university for the state of Louisiana. And we have, excuse me, we do about $150 million plus or minus in research expenditures over the past few years. And we found that when the crisis, the current crisis came up, we were able to leverage some institutional resources that were already in place and have been in place for some time, largely because of the issues that we face from our being a coastal city and the coastal city and the Gulf of Mexico. While we are about 100 miles from the coast, where by the crow flies, hurricanes fly that same distance, and 100 miles is not terribly far when it comes to that. So we've had a lot of experience in dealing with hurricanes. In 2005, during Katrina, LSU realized that it needed to play a role not only in supporting the work that was going on in terms of rescue and recovery in New Orleans, but also in the greater Baton Rouge region. We're about 90 minutes to the west-northwest of New Orleans. And we became a critical part of the rescue and recovery apparatus that was set up post-Katrina. And one of the things that the university did was we created an emergency operations center to help coordinate those emergency related activities. It provided, if you could go back, sorry, I'm not there yet. Go back one slide, sorry, that's okay. So we centralized communication to faculty and staff, students and the public, coordinated critical operations, and managed what our staff refers to as essential personnel. And those are the people who absolutely positively have to be on campus regardless of the situation that we're in. And the EOC has been in operation since 2005 and is called into service anytime there is a significant weather event like a hurricane. They were critical to the regional flooding that we had in 2016. And we've even used them during some winter storms where the city had either heavy snow or ice. And so it was it's become an essential part of the university community in terms of understanding the resiliency of the university and making sure that we are safely operating the university as a whole. Next slide. So you might have heard that New Orleans actually was an epicenter for a very early hotspot for the outbreak of COVID. The first case was first identified on March 10th, and by March 16th, 136 cases. We had 136 cases, and by March 23rd, over 1,000 cases. Most of those cases were in the greater New Orleans area. But by the 23rd, the governor issued his first statewide stay-at-home order. And the purpose of that was, like everywhere else, to try to flatten the curve, flatten the acceleration of cases and the impact that those cases had on health resources within the region. Next slide. So because we are a state institution, we adhere very closely to the governor's orders, and we were in communication with the governor's office very early on. And our office, the Office of Research and Economic Development, was asked to prepare to get information from researchers, from faculty and graduate students, primarily faculty, as to what would happen, or how could they manage their research if there was a curtailment of on-campus operations, specifically for research or other work. So we very quickly ramped up an info-ready review competition that we used essentially as to gather the information and to have it in a way where we could send it through a review process so that we could make decisions and determinations about what could and what shouldn't remain in operation. So we stood that up within less than 24 hours from the time we got the information. And we essentially asked for what we were calling at the time a research continuity plan. And part of the plan, we wanted to know who absolutely needed to be there, what their research was about, was there anything that we needed to be aware of should the curtailment of campus activities happen. At that time, it was not clear whether a full shutdown of the university was going to happen, but it became pretty clear rather quickly as our process was accelerated. Within 3 days, we received over 500 submissions. The submissions were then reviewed by our staff and classified across multiple parameters. Because we stood this up so quickly, we really weren't sure what kind of information we would need and we would get. So we left a lot of the questionnaires wide open for people to, with large text fields, so people could just write what they were thinking about. And then the reviewers then tried to coalesce information from there into a more quantifiable set of data. Next slide. So as we were identifying the critical research and infrastructure, we asked the PIs about their research. We asked things like, can the lab be put into vacation mode? In other words, if something were to happen, could we shut it down and everything would you could just turn it back on and everything would be fine? We were worried about biological specimens that needed to be maintained either through refrigeration or freezing, or whether they were live animals. We're an A&M school. We have a large vet school. So this was something that we knew we had a lot of faculty doing animal-based research. We asked questions about equipment. We have a lot of equipment on campus that requires cooling through liquid nitrogen to be maintained, so that they either don't overheat or that they they have to work at very low temperatures. And then we asked general questions like, are there other concerns about closing? And many of the faculty had comments like, well, we really need, I need to make sure that my computers don't go down, or that there's not a power failure, or that if I need to get something from my office, I can quickly go in and take care of that. They were concerned about flooding. And what was really interesting was that in terms of emergency preparedness and research preparedness, we were talking about COVID, but a lot of the concerns were from people who had experienced either flooding or hurricane damage. And those were the things that we're still carrying through. So that was just as a very interesting aside to that data. And then we asked them to really develop a continuity plan, the minimum number of staff that were needed to sustain their work, to address CDC guidelines in terms of providing a safe environment, and then to enable work from home. And we also asked people if they could do their work entirely remotely. And we also have a large computational research program here. And so a lot of faculty were able to continue their research even though they were working from home. Next slide. So from those answers, we were able to identify about 150 to 200 labs that were what we determined to be critical research and infrastructure. And these really were focused on a couple of the following criteria. They met the following criteria. One was that they were actively involved in COVID-19 research or in some kind of related activity. We got very early on, we received requests from the local business community about getting access to any rapid manufacturing that we might have, 3D printing, CNC, that could be used to manufacture face shields or face masks or other or protective gowns or whatever. And we actually turned our basketball arena, the PMAC, it's called the PMAC, we were able to turn that into a manufacturing facility for face shields and for protective wear. So if those faculty that were involved in that kind of activity or were directly involved in COVID testing or vaccine or treatment development. We also identified people who had instruments that required nitrogen cooling or biological specimens that needed refrigeration or freezing or other kinds of maintenance that required physical presence. And this allowed us to identify those people who could continue to come to campus if, and eventually when, we were told to shut down the university in terms of research operations. What was also useful for this was it helped us prioritize non-critical research for the return to work process that we expected. Next slide. So some of the things that we deduced from this, that we gleaned from all of this activity, was that the pandemic illustrates the importance of research continuity planning. In other words, what do we do? What should researchers do? How should they be prepared for future instances where they are not able to regularly maintain their research, whether it has to be stopped because of a pandemic or weather-related issues. For example, during a hurricane, although during Hurricane Katrina, the university was shut down, I'm trying to remember, maybe a week or two, but during Gustav, it was shut down for a month. We've had ice storms that have shut down the university for a week. We're just not, as a region of the country, we're not equipped for ice storms. So how important is continuity planning to the research process and the resiliency process to make sure that we can sustain what we do? And where should faculty engage in that process? Should it be after their research has already been funded, or whether it should be from the start and be part of the initial planning? And it's become our conclusion that research continuity planning is a critical task in research development. It's just as valuable for short-term shutdowns as it is for pandemics. It's something that needs to be as essential to the development process as data management planning, as making sure you've got the right budget information, as broader impact statements. That it really is an important part of what we should have our faculty do. Next slide. And then there were some administrative benefits that in doing this, it actually gave us a better understanding of research needs. We were able to quickly identify essential personnel and be able to, in future episodes where this is needed, we can collect information where essential personnel can already be available to the EOC, to deans and department chairs, so that they understand who should be on campus and who shouldn't. And then there are research benefits, just improved research resiliency, reduce the impact on protocols, procedures, no-cost extensions, research output and productivity. And the one question that we've been having, and it's been a difficult one, is contingency planning for graduate students. We have a lot of PhD students whose research was interrupted and has been interrupted by the pandemic and by the shutdown. And this has had a negative impact on their ability to move forward with their work. In some cases, they've had to start over in some of the research experiments that they've had, and in other cases, it's delayed their defense and graduation. So having an idea of how we can address this in advance and develop university policies, I think actually is a positive for everybody involved, and something that our office is very, very much eager to start once we kind of get through the current situation. It is something that we will be doing in some way, shape, or form as we move forward. I think I have one more slide, or maybe not. Yes. So for the future, we will be working on guidelines for research continuity planning, and really helping to create a campus culture of planning in the same way of creating a culture of research integrity. We want to create a culture of planning and research continuity by developing some templates that faculty can use, providing workshops and training, and then developing a platform to manage all of those continuity plans. You may have heard that Louisiana has actually kind of stalled its movement towards phase 3 in terms of return to work. The numbers here are growing at a concerning rate. So this planning again helps us adapt to a rapidly changing environment, and one that is, in the case of COVID, a bit unpredictable. So this is an important part of our planning and how we want to move forward. I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Steve. Very much appreciated. Lots of good information there. That is really important in the research operation. We're going to turn this over quickly to Stuart. Dr. Borit, you're up.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to do this. As we were preparing for it, Stephen and I were comparing notes about the research planning, resiliency kinds of in the research space. And we found lots of similarities, which you'll see. And there are a few differences that I'll try to highlight as we're a different kind of school. So next slide. So UNCW is a university, a relatively young university that is rapidly growing and rapidly growing its profile. And so I wanted to make sure to set the stage where there's an understanding that UNCW today, it was just reclassified as an R2 university, so a doctoral university with high research activity. We have currently about 17,500 students. We've been growing at an incredible rate over the last the last decade. We've seen between 30 and 40% increase in student body, and a real growth in majors and a push towards additional doctoral degrees. And so we're a smaller university that is just becoming more research active. Long history in marine science, but in terms of being a more comprehensive research university, we're still in the becoming stage. Next slide. So like LSU, Wilmington is located on the coast. We're on the coast, the southeast coast of North Carolina. We're on the Cape Fear, so we actually stick out a bit into the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see there. Next slide. And I wanted to give you the visual image. So the image on the left is captures the majority of our main campus, which is in the center of New Hanover County, which is basically the center of Wilmington. And what you're looking towards there at the very top of the picture is the Atlantic Ocean. And so our main campus is really close to the ocean itself. And frankly, if you go in the opposite direction, you're only 5-6 miles from the Cape Fear River. So we're between two major water bodies. In addition to the main campus, we have the UNCW Crest campus, which is what's pictured there on the right. This houses a lot of our marine science research. It's mostly a research park. And what you see there is the dock extends from the main facilities out into the intercoastal waterway. So it's even closer to the water itself. Next slide. To put it into perspective, where we just heard LSU that being around $150 million in terms of research and development expenditures, Wilmington is at a different scale. So we're currently $17.5 million in expenditures, which has been pretty consistent for the last 5-6 years. We are active on innovation and commercialization, so we're full service, but again at a smaller scale. Next click. So if you look at the sponsored programs from the last 5 years, about 62% of that is coastal and marine science related. A lot of that is focused around our Center for Marine Science, which has over 100 affiliated faculty and staff. There are only about 700 faculty at tenure track faculty in CW. So that's a large percentage. It includes the North Carolina Shellfish Hatchery, an aquaculture program. It's actually at another facility I didn't even show. We've got this marine biotechnology in North Carolina program that's looking at drug discovery from the sea, algal resource collections, and then PhDs in marine biology and another one in applied and coastal ocean sciences. So you can see that we're very strongly tied to the coastal location as part of our research infrastructure. Next click. And we've got a number of areas of growing strength. We've got a relatively new psychology PhD program that is growing pretty rapidly. Pharmaceutical science is a proposed new PhD that builds again on that marine biotechnology program. So we're building from the marine sciences out into the pharmaceutical sciences. We have a very rapidly growing health and human services college. And so we're growing rapidly there, but do not have a medical school. And then computer and information sciences and educational leaderships are other areas of strength, just to give a picture of the university. Next. So being at the coast, we have many of the same kind of coastal challenges that Stephen talked about for LSU. And so the first image here is of Hurricane Florence that came ashore in September of 2018. While Hurricane Florence was by wind speed only a Category 1 hurricane, when it was a direct hit to Wilmington, and it came ashore, and it was basically a hurricane, a Category 1 hurricane for 3 days instead of a 6-hour kind of window. That resulted in $140 million worth of damages to UNCW, which included the loss of Dobo Hall, which was our major science building. Again, somewhere between 40 and 60% of our sponsored research occurred in that one building. And it closed campus for an entire month. And I include this in part because the response to emergencies like this are not new for UNCW. Next click. So Hurricane Dorian came by. It was not the monster storm. We did not experience the monster storm that the Caribbean got from Hurricane Dorian, but it did come by, it did brush the coast, and it did close the university for another week. And what I'll tell you is between Florence and Dorian, there are a couple of things. Florence really highlighted some of the physical resiliency needs for campus. Stephen talked a little bit about the response of the researchers to things like the power outage, right? So all of our biologists were very, very interested in making sure that their freezers were still cold, right? That's definitely a key piece. One of the things that we learned from Hurricane Florence, the campus made a critical decision to actually turn off the power to campus before the storm, because historically the major impacts to campus have been through the burnout of electrical equipment and the brownouts that come as the power fluctuates. So for the first time in memory, they turned the power off to campus, which made a lot of sense. But it turns out that the backup generators, even on the research buildings, are designed for 3 days of fuel supply to fuel the life safety equipment. That the research activities were not part of the initial design. And so because they turned the power off to campus a day before the storm came, and the storm lasted 3 days, and then power wasn't restored for a period thereafter, there are buildings that lost power even though there was backup power. Or in one case, there was a building where the generator was refueled in the middle of the hurricane. That's not a practice that I recommend. And then, from all of this, again, thinking about data management plans and how you do that. And so that brings us to thinking about the COVID pandemic. And so, Carlos, next slide, or next click, thank you. And so we were well prepared in some instances for the COVID pandemic. The university, March 20th, basically after a variety of slower ramp down pieces, by March 20th, we basically went into virtual operations mode, moved all classes online, and restricted access to campus pretty severely. And the way we managed that research ramp down is that the research office worked with a number of stakeholders to develop a definition of critical research activities, much like Stephen talked about. But then we actually had a decentralized process for the ramp down. The decision-making around critical research activities was made at the supervisor level, which in most cases meant the dean was making the decisions about the ramp down. And in that process, there are some activities that continued a little bit longer. If there was an experiment that could be concluded in the next week, they were given a little bit of additional access in that ramp down process. But ultimately, a pretty tight control on that. For our research ramp up phase, our research ramp up process, here we did the opposite. We actually used that centralized questionnaire kind of approach. PIs have to apply for access. They have to submit a standard operating protocol to be approved. We've given some templates, we've given guidance, but that has to be a part of the application. That goes through an internal review process that lets us make sure that we, depending on the type of research, are we going to have the core facilities or core services available to provide that, to support that? And then as we're able, we are approving research, limited research coming back to campus. And so that's been our process. Next slide, Carlos. So we used InfoReady for that ramp up process when we actually created the survey in InfoReady. And I think I've said all this. We're really emphasizing externally funded research as a priority, whether that you've got the funding or are working on the funding. Seasonal research, again, because so much of our work is oriented towards coastal and marine sciences. If you don't go sample the flounder this month, you're going to miss their juvenile process, and that puts you a whole year behind, not just a couple of days behind. And then, as Stephen talked about, focusing on graduate student research, making sure that to the degree we can, that the graduate students, particularly the PhD students, are able to successfully continue their work to be able to graduate in a reasonable amount of time. All right, I've said all of that. So next slide. So looking to the fall, where the university is, like many universities, we're looking to try to open in a mix of face-to-face, hybrid, and online kind of operational pieces, but really opening in a face-to-face kind of format, where we'll have students, staff, and faculty on campus to some degree. And it may be that some staff continue to telework, but some of the students and faculty will certainly be on campus if things continue where we are now. But when we're looking towards the fall, part of what we need to do is help all of our researchers be prepared to ramp up or ramp down research as the virus dictates. We are anticipating that the campus will switch that there's a strong possibility that the campus will have to switch from that face-to-face to a virtual online environment if there is the predicted, we might call it the second wave, although given the way that the virus is rising right now, it might be the third wave by the time we're looking at October. So, so having that flexibility. Next slide. And so what we're looking at for next steps as a tool to help the researchers is developing something like what Stephen was talking about in terms of the research continuity plan or a research continuity of operations plan, pulling from environmental health and safety kinds of language. We're thinking of this as a PI responsibility. We give a template, we give a way to do that. Part of what I'm trying to think about, or what we're trying to think about as we're developing this, is integrating some of the planning that we've already been doing. PIs with laboratories have had to have a hurricane emergency plan. How can we incorporate that, fold that into a larger research continuity type plan? Issues around that when we're talking about the pandemic itself, things like what kind of safety guidance are we going to have in terms of the maximum population density for research spaces? If we're going to maintain a 6 foot distance, it takes at least 40, maybe 50 square feet per individual in a space. You can start helping researchers think through how many people should be in the laboratory at one time. One of our challenges at the moment that I think many universities are talking about is how are we going to do human subject research? And that's human subject research on campus, as well as thinking about how our students and staff and faculty are going to interact out in the community, that community engaged research. And so developing health and safety protocols is going to be another key piece. And so that's where we're headed. That's a short story of UNCW, where we've been with this, and the next step. So we'll move to the question and answer.
Thanks, Stuart. Much appreciated. You know, it's great to get both perspectives there, and it's good to have side by side different types of institutions that have experienced similar events in the past and been able to adapt from there. So we have received a few questions here, and don't forget, if you have questions, submit them in the chat option or the Q&A option on screen in the Zoom tool. I don't know what they call it, the Zoom panel. So why don't we start with the Q&A? So first question, what was the response rate when requesting planning inputs via InfoReady? What, if anything, did you do to drive participation?
Well, I'll take a first stab at it. The response rate was pretty good. I mean, we sent out a broadcast communication directly to all faculty, and also encouraged department chairs and deans to communicate this to their faculty. And within the first 24 hours, we had 250 responses. And over a 3-day period, we received up to a little over 500 responses. And so we thought that was a pretty good response rate. And our motivation was actually really simple. We made it really clear that if they did not submit this, they wouldn't be able to maintain their, they would have zero chance of maintaining their research while the university was shut down. They wouldn't be able to get into their campus labs. They wouldn't even be able to be considered. Now, a lot of people who submitted were also deemed to be not critical infrastructure or not critical research, so they were not allowed to continue during the shutdown. But the motivation was, making sure you can keep doing what you want to do. And actually, I think that under the circumstances, people were quite eager to help. The issues, we had other issues when we had to send follow-up surveys coming from different parts of the university to get information during the shutdown. One of the things that did happen with us is that while we handled that initial survey, the EOC handled a follow-up survey that identified specifically who was going to be on campus, because that wasn't people were not responding quite as clearly in the initial as we needed, as we learned more about what we needed to provide. So that's that. Stuart?
On our survey, it's because we're doing it on the back end. The response has been, there are two pieces that influence the response. One is we were very clear that we were looking for applications for the phase 1 of research ramp up, and that meant that you had to have some compelling reason to need to get back into a physical space on campus. So anybody not using a research laboratory or facility was excluded. If you could do your work by telework, please do your work by telework, was the message. So there was we weren't trying to get everybody on campus to respond. However, so we're a month into that, and we've had between 40 and 50 applicants for the research ramp up process. Many of those have been approved to have access, depending on the facilities that were needed and the process. So a fair amount of researchers were able to get back into the lab at some level along the way.
Thank you. There's a couple follow-up questions to that. One, what sort of things are you considering when you receive interest from, well, that's not, I read the wrong one, I'm sorry. Given there may be interest in sponsored research, in what ways do you plan to mitigate issues with COVID-19? One reaction is that students and faculty may not be quite open to taking on sponsored research projects. Do you agree?
I think that faculty are eager to do their work. I think, and a lot of faculty who work in areas that have a natural affinity for working on COVID-related research were very eager to say, how can I help? And so we had a lot of people, we had a lot of faculty try to leverage existing awards to get some special supplemental funding from NSF or NIH to continue their work, and so there was no and I should also say that during this time there's been no layoff on the number of grant applications that have gone out. Grant proposals that have gone out. We've been receiving awards, we've been submitting proposals. That actually has not changed significantly at all during this time. I think the concern that faculty have had, and we've seen this in the questionnaires that we asked, and I know that Stewart's had the same responses, is that who's going to pay, how do I get PPE? Who's going to pay for the PPE? What sorts of things do I need to do? And part of that is we ask these questions of them to also get their, how would you take a lab that is a series of wet lab benches? How do you divide those benches up so that students can work 6 feet apart from one another? How do you stagger work schedules so that people only work where there's only maybe 1 or 2 people in a lab at any one point in time? How, what are the things that that you will do towards this? And so we really left it to the ingenuity of the individual faculty, but that was they also had concerns, and it's taken a little bit of effort from our finance administration to figure out what's the best way to provide PPE, things like hand sanitizers and masks, and what is our policy going to be. The university seems to be coalescing around a process as we look to reopening not only research, but also campus for classes.
It's very similar at UNCW in terms of the majority of the really active researchers were very anxious to get back into the research labs, and many of them asking, how do we pivot the current research program to address something that might be useful related to COVID itself or the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic. As we don't have a medical school, we don't have a lot of that direct virus kinds of research, but a lot of interest in the psychology department and a number of folks looking at different aspects of the impact of the shutdown and the behavioral changes that people experienced as they were in that shutdown mode. In terms of trying to get the PPE in, we're still muddling our way through that. We're working, as you said, Stephen, coalescing on a centralized kind of approach for how we're going to approach that as a campus. But I'll say that one of and this is partially responding to another question that I've seen, one of the biggest issues has been the safety protocol, so that for the research community, when we were approving projects, we were approving them with a standard operating protocol that with some guidelines that had been set by our health and safety and environmental health and safety committees. One of our challenges has been, as we're increasing the density of activity in some of the buildings, not all of the groups have had similar expectations. One of the complaints from at least one researcher, one research facility, is that the facilities and some of the security folks initially didn't have the same expectations for PPE, for example. So the researchers all had to have face coverings, but the maintenance folks didn't when they came to work on it. And so that created more tension that we've been working to resolve, to have a clear, consistent messaging about the expectations on the safety protocols in the research spaces as a whole, but really across campus for operations. And coalescing is the right word, I think, for that.
Thank you, Steve and Stuart, for those detailed answers. It was very insightful. Now, Stuart, you said you partially answered one of the questions that you could see. So here, I think this might be the question. What has been your biggest challenge in enforcing only essential research be carried out on site? Steve?
Yeah, so I think the challenge, well, so enforcing the research, enforcing the rules as to who can and can't be on campus is actually falls into the category of not our job. That's really the responsibility of the Emergency Operations Center and the police. And to be frank, the police were doing periodic checks on buildings and making sure that the people who were there were supposed to be there. So it wasn't something that our office actually had to do. I think we had, in a lot of cases, we had to rely, as we always do, we have to rely on the goodwill and compassion of our faculty, that they realize that, you know, what is the right thing to do, and the right thing to do is to stay home. The right thing to do is to wear a mask. The right thing to do is to manage social distancing. And if you can't do it, then you run the risk of your own personal liability and your own personal health. So we really did rely on the goodwill of the faculty and their understanding that that these are serious times and that they need to respect that.
For UNCW, that the answer is very similar. That enforcement is the best way to enforce this is going to be through internal peer pressure and the understanding of why the safety measures are in place. I'll also say that it's gotten even more complicated recently, because not only are we trying to ramp up the research for the summer, but at the same time, that science building that we lost back in 2018 due to Hurricane Florence, it is fully renovated and is ready to move in the next week. And so we have many of our key researchers are in the midst of also having to pack up their research labs and offices in preparation for moving to new facilities from temporary quarters. And so we've got a group of folks that are trying to do research. We've got another group that is trying to wind everything down and be ready to pack, and different intents, different purposes, different processes guiding that. And that's it presents some interesting challenges when you have multiple groups showing up. The movers are showing up. Who's telling them what the expectations are for health and safety precautions, for example?
I think that's a really interesting point about opening new buildings. I could probably say that most of the people attending the webinar, their institutions are probably opening new buildings sometime this year. So there has to be a thoughtful approach to how people move in and from one building to another, and how operations are going to change. Have another question here. This is about research plans. Can you talk about the step-by-step decision-making of the research plans, i.e. who was at the table when those were decided?
So I know that it was different for Wilmington, and I think this was one of the things that Stuart and I, when we were talking beforehand, were really quite interested in. When we were first looking at the Rampdown, we were at, our office was asked to manage the process, and so we had very clear instructions from the EOC and from the provost's office as to what were the things that were most important, and so it really was between the provost's office and ourselves as to analyzing the research plans as they came in and trying to figure out what would be viable in the various phases of work. But as we, and so on the ramp down side, a lot of that work was really done through our office. But in the ramp up process, which we have been in the process of, we've used the data that we collected, but it was actually the deans and department chairs who were making decisions about who would be allowed back in. I think part of that was that they felt like they wanted to make sure that they had a better understanding of who was doing what and when. So it started off on the ramp down side. It was really our office that made a lot of the decisions. And to be fair, there weren't that many decisions to be made once the word got out that we were not, that research had to be shut down. It was very clear. It was COVID research and anything that needed to be preserved or maintained. All other research came to a stop. And then on the flip side, it was the deans who led the return decision-making process.
So for Wilmington, so in my responsibilities as chief research officer, worked with the deans on the ramp down process, and they worked directly with the chairs. And part of what we found in that process is that there were, it was hard to be internally consistent because there were different people making different decisions at different points. And so on the ramp up process, there was a group of individuals, again, including the research office, our executive director for marine science, and some of our more active, the deans of some of our more research active universities, chatting together about designing the process and then running that from the research office in a more centralized kind of approach. And so conversations at different levels. And again, in terms of the recommendations, the guidance for health and safety, bringing in both our student health center as well as our environmental health and safety operations, trying to make sure that we had a number of folks at the table, trying to make sure that as we're ramping up, we're doing it as safely as possible.
Thank you for those answers. Now, we've got about 6 minutes left. I think we can fit in a couple questions. If you're comfortable going over, are you comfortable going over by a couple minutes? There's quite a bit of.
Sure.
That's fine,
buddy. So here was the question, quote, did the transition of research administration to teleworking happen smoothly at your institution? Have proposal development and financial management been included in contingency planning? Any best practices or lessons learned?
So I can say that for LSU, the transition of research administration to telework was actually rather smooth. The university has had web conferencing and meeting software for some time. They had just switched to Zoom, maybe at the beginning of the academic year. So people were familiar with it. There was one small hiccup, and that was that the university, or ITS in their infinite wisdom, decided to change VPN vendors like 2 days before we were supposed to be shut down. And so there was some issues in getting the right software on people's laptops or home computers so that they could continue that. But once that was straightened out, it was actually a rather smooth process. We had just implemented a new electronic research administration platform, but for our pre-award work, and had already, part of that also included our conflict of interest work. So all of those processes, conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment, significant financial interest disclosures, and then all of the pre-award work was already online and already electronic, including system-to-system submissions. So so our transition actually worked really well, and we were, looking back at our internal processes, we had spent about 3.5, 4 years in rolling out this new platform from the time we started looking at possibilities to the time we actually implemented, and it came just at the right time. Had we not had those systems in place, it would have been much harder for us to maintain our administration. That said, as I said earlier, the rate of submissions, the rate of reviews, all of that, none of that was impacted as we went home and worked from home. Things were a little slower, a little harder, but for the most part, we saw really no negative impact of any significance, in part because we were prepared.
It's a very similar answer for UNCW. We have an electronic research administration system in place and have for a number of years. We had some experience in terms of, again, operating remotely. And so the transition to the telework or remote work from home situation for the research administration side was relatively seamless. It's worked remarkably well. There's definitely developing some new communication tools for the team as a whole, since having everybody operate that way is a little different. But in terms of the electronic, most of the process and systems are in place for that to work without a hitch. So that was really, really pleasant. And similar to LSU, the number of submissions has not decreased. In fact, after the initial period of faculty having to pay attention to converting classes to be all online, we've seen things return back to at least normal, if not a little uptick in terms of submissions. When we're watching expenditures, we haven't seen an impact on expenditures yet. That's a little surprising to me. I suspect that we may see that in June and July. But that's so far we're almost but looking at the metrics and overall performance of the research administration team, we're pretty normal, surprisingly.
That's good news. Now, here's one last question for the two of you, since we're almost out of time. And this relates to professors and researchers and other scholars and students who may be international students or may have been out of the country. So the question relates to new immigration orders and requesting exemptions. So what ramifications do you think the freeze will have on universities' ability to bring researchers in for the incoming academic year?
Stuart, you want to take that one first?
Sure. So The university was anticipating this news, and so there was an effort to push through as many of the pending visas for faculty, staff, and students as possible. So we've had a flurry of response in that way. In terms of, I'm not aware of the any kind of process for where there might be an exception clause for the research activities or for the university. If that exists, that'll be a huge gift. You know, if I'm thinking about UNCW, it'll definitely have a noticeable impact. If we think about, you know, university, higher education and you know, teaching and research nationwide, it seems like this could have a huge impact.
Yeah, and I know that I can't speak for our office directly because this is just so new that we're not really we haven't had a chance to fully discuss it. But I will say, from my time as director of our High Performance Computing Research Center, we rely heavily on H-1B visas to make sure that we have the very best people in the world working at our labs. And I think that there's no doubt that this will have a negative impact on our ability to recruit the very best in the world in some of these very critical areas. And so, you know, it's I understand why some may think that it's a good idea to put these restrictions on, but there is a significant negative impact that will happen on this. And so I'm in this regard, I'm really just speaking on my own, you know, from my own experience, having run a center that relied heavily on an international team of researchers.
Thank you, Stuart and Steve, for all of the great information you shared from your experiences with the COVID-19 pandemic, and also prior experiences with responses to hurricanes on campus. I think that it's been pretty instructive, and we had several other questions that were submitted that I think you would have had great answers to. Do you mind if we share those with you and the contact information for the people who ask them?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. And so thanks again for your time. As I mentioned, we've reached the end of the hour. Thanks also for everyone who attended today. The panelist contact information is in the presentation. If you'd like the slides sent to you, we can also connect you with them if you're interested. We also have a peer spotlight webinar next month with Appalachian State University, back to back with the state of North Carolina. So a panelist there will be Katie Howard, Associate Director in the Grant Resources and Services unit of the Office of Research. So the topic there will be using Infinity Review for research and beyond. They're using the system for quite a few different processes within the Office of Research and using it in several other units on campus. So that's slated for Tuesday, July 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can register on our website. And if you have any questions for the panelists or for us, I mentioned that there's a post-webinar survey. There's going to be a couple of ways to answer that survey. One, when you leave the webinar, you should be directed to the survey form itself. I think we may also be emailing out the survey as well. In addition, I mentioned that this webinar was recorded, so we'll have that edited and tidied up and posted in the next week or so. As I mentioned before, if you'd like that sent to you, we'd be glad to send you that and the slides. If you want to talk about InfoReady and how it can benefit your organization, please contact my colleague Max Dinerman. If you want to talk about any of the product functionality that may have been involved, that may be involved in some of the processes they mentioned, feel free to contact me or our support team. And with that, thanks again for your time. Everyone have a great day. Stay safe, and enjoy the upcoming holiday. I'm sure we can all use it.
Thank you, Carlos.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks.